Okay, so now let's get into Lincoln becoming president after he was elected during the election of 1860. Lincoln's inauguration takes place on March 4th, 1861, because that is when inaugurations took place back then. They did not take place on January 20th like they do now. The inauguration speech assured the seceded states that he meant them no harm. So those states like South Carolina that had left, he said he meant no harm. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery where it exists. So that right there should have said, where it exists right now, nothing is going to happen. I am not going to do anything to get rid of it. So that shows that he's not necessarily a true abolitionist at this time. Now, that does mean, though, that he is not going to let it spread any further into those Western territories that might someday become states. The seceding states were taking over post offices, forts, and other federal property that was within their own borders of their states. Fort Sumter is located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. I've actually toured Fort Sumter. Very neat if you're ever in Charleston, South Carolina. The fort's commander would not surrender, so the South Carolina authorities decided to starve the fort's 100 troops until they did surrender. So the fort is federal property, but South Carolina moved in and tried to overtake it. They were cut off from supplies since late December, and they could not hold out much longer. Lincoln did not want to give up the fort. He feared that sending in troops would cause other states to secede because it might look like the North, or the United States, those that are still involved and did not secede, were attacking those states that did secede. And he was very afraid of what that would bring about. He announced he would send food to the fort, supply ships, would not carry guns or troops, just food. He just wanted to make sure that those that were trapped were not starving. Confederate leaders decided to capture the fort, and on April 12th, Confederates opened fire on the fort. So the Confederates started shooting. After 34 hours, the U.S. troops did surrender, and that marked the beginning of the Civil War. And just to give you an idea of the definition of a civil war, that is a war between opposing groups of citizens of the same country. Okay, so it is a country fighting amongst itself. That is civil war. President Lincoln asked the governors to raise 750,000 troops to put down the rebellion in the South. Most states in the North were eager and wanted to send more troops than was requested. Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri were not willing to send men to fight against our Southern brothers. And Maryland and Delaware did not respond to the request for troops. The president called for troops, and that led to more states leaving the Union. On April 17th, Virginia left. The western countries of Virginia had little support for slavery, so this area did not secede. So in 1863, these 50 counties would enter into the Union as West Virginia, and that is how we got Virginia and West Virginia. So West Virginia was part of the North, and Virginia, that is the part that seceded or left the Union. In May, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina left. Here is the order of the states that left the Union. So as you see, started with South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and so on and so forth. What the border states and why they are so important, those are the slave states that did not secede. And you're kind of thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. I thought everybody was fighting over slavery and all slave states left. No, not the case. Remember, the Civil War was not fought over slavery. The Civil War was fought over states' rights and the states deciding how to run their own states. The border states included Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland. Kentucky and Missouri were important to controlling the Ohio and Mississippi rivers because you need that to transport goods. The Union has to hold Maryland, otherwise Washington would be surrounded by Confederacy. So that was very important to hold on to Maryland and don't let them secede. Even if they are a slave state, let's just let them stay here, have slavery, because like I said, Civil War, not fought over slavery. At first, Kentucky was neutral. They're not going to favor either side. Lincoln refused to occupy Kentucky out of fear that they would secede. So the Confederacy moved into Kentucky in 1861, and Kentucky is very taken back by that. And they're like, why are there troops here? We're not getting involved at all. So they reacted by then turning their support to the northern states. Missouri and Maryland, the president wants to hold strong to these two states. The Missouri government sided with the South, and Union supporters set up their own state government. Fighting broke out within the state, and Lincoln sent in troops, and the state stayed in the Union. Maryland, the Southern supporters were destroying railroad and telegraph lines, and Lincoln placed Eastern Maryland under martial law. Martial law is the type of rule in which the military is in charge, and citizens' rights are basically suspended. Officials and others suspected of disloyalty were jailed without trial. So you didn't have a right to a fair trial during that time under martial law. Oops, wrong way. The Southern advantages during this war, the South would be fighting on their own territory. So they would know the land and the layout and everything else. Oopsie. Sorry about that. Clicked on the wrong thing. Come on, internet. Oh my gosh. All right. For the North to win, they would have to invade the South and conquer the South. They had very experienced military officers in the South because the top 3 Confederate generals had retired from the U.S. Army, so they could fight for the South because they were fighting for states' rights and they believed that the states should be seceding. The Northern advantage is of the 130,000 factories in the United States, 110,000 of those were in the North. So they could produce more goods to support the military. More railroad lines were in the North, so they could transport goods easily. And they had 2 times more farmland in the North. So not only could they make things, but they could also grow things. They also had a larger population to draw support and get more troops from. 2/3 of the country's population lived in the northern part of the country. So most of the South's population, were enslaved people. And they didn't count as people. Do you remember that? They were just property. The North was able to field, feed, and equip larger families. The North strategy, Lincoln wanted to isolate the Confederacy, so they set up blockades. That's a military action to prevent traffic from coming into an area or leaving it. They hoped to cut off the South's supply of manufactured goods and block the overseas sales of cotton. The North wanted to gain control of the Mississippi River because that was the South's major transportation link. And if they did take over the Mississippi River, if you were to look at a map, it would split the South into 2. And that would weaken them. The Union planned on invading Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, and that was located 100 miles from Washington, D.C. So that's kind of hard to think about, that both sides, their capitals, were just a short distance away from each other. The South's war strategy was they wanted to just play defense. They had to defend their own land, and they only had to defend their land until the Northerners were too tired to fight. The Confederates tried to get aid from Britain and European nations, but Britain's need of cotton for their textile mills would force them to support the South. They needed the cotton from the South, so they had to pretty much support them. A soldier's life, 3/4 of the time the soldiers were in camp and they weren't fighting. They trained for 10 hours a day. They stood guard. They wrote letters. They gathered firewood. So I don't want you to think the whole time they're fighting. They're just, I don't want to say hanging out, but getting prepared. Camp conditions were miserable. The wet weather created muddy roads and fields. They had a lack of clean water, and they had health threats. They had outbreaks of smallpox, typhoid fever, and other diseases. They had prisoners of war. Both sides built prison camps for captured soldiers. They were forced to eat rats, low supply of food, overcrowding, disease. Hundreds of prisoners died each day, usually from starvation. Now, the new technology during this time, obviously, I use technology loosely. New weapons made it more deadly than previous wars. We had rifles, and the cannons are more accurate and had greater range than old muskets. They loaded much faster. The attacking army could be bombarded long before it arrived at a defender's location. And since they could be loaded quicker, they could shoot and fire so much more rapid at whoever was attacking them or who they were attacking, which would obviously cause higher casualties. Ironclads are the warships that are covered with a protective iron plate. The cannon fire bounced off this armor. The Union's ironclad was called the Monitor, and the Confederates' iron ship was called the Merrimac. And the use of ironclads marked the end of the wooden warships that were previously used. Usually, when we have a normal school year, I will have you research the importance of these battles, the date, the outcome, and why they are so important. But due to time, we're just going to skip over that, unfortunately. Emancipating the slaves. So, emancipate means to free. Lincoln feared that if he emancipated the slaves, the border states would support the Confederacy. Remember, the border states are those states that did not leave the Union, but they still had slavery. So Lincoln's goal was to restore the Union, bringing everybody back together. But he ends up changing his mind because he realized slavery was vital to the South's war effort. So Lincoln informed his cabinet that he intended to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a huge turning point in the Civil War. The cabinet advised him to wait until after a big success on the battlefield. So the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st of 1863. It did not cause changes or uproar immediately, but it would free the enslaved people only in areas that were fighting the Union. So, places where the Union had no power. So, those border states, it did not impact them at all because they were not fighting against the Union. So, that would still allow them to stay with the Union. They would not feel like they were threatened and that they had to leave and join the South. The South accused Lincoln was trying to cause a slave revolt. So, what is this proclamation that Lincoln is going to put out there? Well, basically, at first, it freed very few slaves. But the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, and you'll need to know this, is it changed the Civil War into a war over slavery. Okay, before that, it was a war for states' rights. After the Emancipation Proclamation, it changes to a war about slavery. So it changed the Civil War into a struggle for freedom. The war was no longer a fight to save a nation. Instead, it was now going to be a fight to end slavery. So it took away any hopes that Britain would recognize the South's independence because Britain would not help a government that was fighting to keep people enslaved based on their beliefs. So it united African Americans in support of the war. At this time, African Americans are not permitted to join the Union at the beginning of the war, but they are allowed to serve in the war after the emancipation. So at that point, 189,000 served in the Union Army or Navy, and more than half were actually former slaves who had escaped or were freed by the fighting. If captured, they're not treated as prisoners of war. Instead, they are treated as runaway slaves, which sadly is probably harder on them than being treated as a prisoner of war. They had blending of races on warships, and in the Army, the races were separated into all Black regiments, and they were led by white officers. They also usually earned less pay than white soldiers. So basically, when the slaves in the South on the plantations hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, it basically says, anyone that is enslaved in any of the states that is fighting against the Union, you are now free. Well, the Southern states are going to look at this like, we're not under your control. You can't even say that. But the slaves are going to say, well, we're going to leave. We are no longer, slavery cannot happen. So it's really kind of a touchy situation. Some of the African Americans that are most famous for helping the Union was the African Americans that led the attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry led that attack on July 18th, 1863. The unit volunteered to lead the assault. The soldiers were charged and cannons fired, and they were rained down on them. The 54th reached the top of the fort's walls before being turned back in hand-to-hand fighting. And if you've ever seen the movie Glory, this is the battle that takes place at the end of that movie. The whole movie is based on the 54th Massachusetts. Thousands supported in non-combat roles such as cooks, wagon drivers, and hospital aides. People on both sides tried to disrupt the war effort. They tried to encourage soldiers to desert, to leave, and they helped the prisoners of war to escape. They would prevent the men from volunteering for military service. And to deal with these problems, both sides suspended the right of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is that constitutional protection against unlawful imprisonment. So basically, if you did anything, you could be put in jail and you would not receive a trial. The draft, that's a system of required military service. The South adopted the draft first because of their lower population. They had to add to their military. It was required that white men between 18 and 35 years of age to serve in the military for 3 years. The age range expanded from 17 to 50 years old, and the North would adopt similar laws in 1863 for men between the ages of 20 and 45. Now, there were some exceptions to the draft. The wealthy had many ways of escaping fighting. In the South, if you owned 20 slaves, you didn't have to serve. So anyone with a large plantation, obviously you're going to have money. You don't have to serve. Both sides allowed draftees to hire substitutes. Once again, the only person that would be able to afford to hire a substitute are those that are wealthy. Northerners could pay $300 to escape the draft. Once again, $300 is a lot of money back then, so you had to be wealthy. Both sides argued that the draft made the war a poor man's fight, and I would have to agree with them on that. The war and economic strains that it placed in these two separate parts of our country. In the North, the northern industries boomed. They were supplying the war effort. There were plenty of jobs available to everybody, but there was a shortage because of the draft taking away workers. So to pay for the war, Congress levied the first income tax in America's history in August of 1861. And an income tax is not a tax that's fun, but it is necessary. That's a tax on the money that people receive. So like the money I earn from being a teacher, a portion of that goes to the government. It's called an income tax. What they did is they printed more money, which led to inflation, and that caused prices to rise. So the prices of goods would increase on an average of 80% in the North during this time, which is pretty drastic. They're less able to sustain the war. The Union blockade prevented the South from raising money by selling overseas. And the shortages made goods more expensive. And there's higher and worse inflation taking place in the South. And food production fell as invading armies destroyed farmland and crops. So in the South, it is harder. That's where the fighting's taking place. So you think about it, when soldiers are going in, they're not leaving the area where they just left all nice and cozy. They are destroying it, burning everything in their paths to really make an impact on their enemies, which would be the South. The shortages of food led to riots in southern cities. And one thing that did happen was, if some of these larger homes, smaller plantations, the men were gone sometimes. Well, not so much the plantations because they were wealthy and they didn't have to go fight, but the larger homes, the men were gone. You know, if they had sons, they were gone fighting. And it was, sometimes it was women left to take care of a large farm and the house. And these northern troops, the Union troops, would come in, destroy the homes, sometimes beat the women, and just take everything from them. So these women were left with nothing. Sometimes the women during the war disguised themselves as men so they could fight. They were spies behind enemy lines. They took over businesses, took care of farms, plantations while the men were fighting. And this is seen in a movie that, I don't even know how many years old this is, quite a bit, called Cold Mountain. And it's a really good movie if you're ever looking for something to watch. It's more like a love story, but it shows a good example of how women did have to hold down the homestead during this fighting. They also do factory work, and new opportunities of women come about because of the war. Some became teachers or nurses. And before the war, these careers were dominated by men, but now it's becoming more prominent that women do this. After the Union victory at 1862 at the Battle of Antietam, the war began to go badly for the North. It wasn't looking too well for the North. McClellan replaced General Ambrose Burnside, and McClellan was fired by Lincoln because he was too cautious. Some Confederate victories. In Richmond, December of 1862, Burnside marched his army of 120,000 men directly toward Richmond. The ordered charge after charge on Lee and his men. The Union had 13,000 casualties in the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the Confederates nearly 5,000. Chancellorsville took place in May of 1863. The Union was led by General Joseph Hooker. They call him Fighting Joe. They were smashed by the Confederates, and the battle was also costly for Confederates. Stonewall Jackson was shot and wounded and would die a few days later after the Battle of Chancellorsville. Gettysburg, Lee was looking for a major victory on Union soil in hopes that it would push the Northerners to surrender. July 1st of 1863, Confederate soldiers marched into Pennsylvania. They were looking for shoes because they were in short supply, or any supplies that they could get their hands on. And that was because they were low on supplies, because the Union was doing such a good job of blockading them and not allowing them to get supplies in. They encountered Meade's troops, shots were exchanged, and both sides received more support and more troops as the day drug on. The Confederates pushed the Union troops back through Gettysburg. On July 2nd, 1863, 85,000 Union troops encounter 75,000 Confederates. The Confederate troops attacked the Union troops from two sides. July 3rd of 1863, Lee ordered all-out attack on the center of the Union line. General George E. Pickett led the 15,000 Confederate troops across a mile of open field, and the Union troops fired on them as they were crossing the open field. Only a few hundred men reached the Union line, only to be quickly driven back. 7,500 Confederates were killed or wounded in what is known as Pickett's Charge. The Confederacy suffered more than 28,000 casualties during the three-day battle at Gettysburg, and the Union losses exceeded 23,000. So it was a very brutal battle for both sides. Vicksburg, Grant's attacks on Vicksburg began in May of 1863. It was one of the last cities on the Mississippi River to remain in Confederate hands. The residents took shelter in cellars and in caves they dug in hillsides for days. They ate mules and rats to keep from starving. It lasted 6 weeks, and 30,000 Confederate troops finally gave up. The war had taken a turn to be under Union control at this time. And Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, along with events at Vicksburg, make July of 1863 the major turning point of the war, and making it seem as though the Union will be able to pull off a victory. In November of 1863, 15,000 people gathered on the battlefield at Gettysburg to honor the fallen soldiers. Lincoln looked ahead and spoke a hopeful Union victory as he gave the Gettysburg Address, which I will now play for you, if the link is still working.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
All right. That is a beautiful speech. In spring of 1864, Grant's army hammered at the Confederates in a series of battles in northern Virginia. Grant was unable to break through Lee's troops. Grant did not retreat. Rather, he continued the attacks. The fighting lasted for 7 weeks, and Grant lost 55,000 men, and Lee had lost 35,000. But what helped Grant was the North had a steady stream of men and supplies because of that industrial sector that is in the northern portion of the country. Lee was running out of men and supplies. The two armies continued to clash at Petersburg. That is the railroad center south of Richmond. And in June of 1864, Grant began a siege. And a siege is an attempt to capture a place by surrounding it with military forces and cutting it off until the people inside surrender. This is the same strategy that Grant used at Vicksburg. As Grant and Lee continued to battle it out, William Tecumseh Sherman advanced toward Atlanta. He's a tough soldier. He believed in total war, so that meant all-out attacks aimed at destroying an enemy's army, its resources, and anything that got in its way. So not just fighting soldiers, but fighting everything, towns, roads, railroads, destroying it all. The Confederates could not stop Sherman's advances, so the Union Army marched into Atlanta on September 2nd, 1864, and captured Atlanta for the Union. The success gave Lincoln's re-election campaign a boost, and it allowed him to win the election over General George McClellan, which was the Democrats' candidate. Prior to the success at Atlanta, the Northerners were growing tired of the war and not seeing much hope that it would be successful for them. November of 1864, Sherman ordered that Atlanta be burned. He then marched east towards the Atlantic Ocean, and on their way to the Atlantic, the Union troops set fire to buildings, seized crops and livestock, and pulled up railroad tracks, leaving a total path of destruction up to 60 miles wide. Now, during fighting, this is a really good tactic to use, but to give you a little insight of what's going to happen, when the country starts coming together, all of this destruction is going to have to be repaired, and someone's going to have to pay for it. So this will cost the country as a whole a ton of money. In March of 1865, Grant's army was still waiting outside of Petersburg. They were expanding his battle lines further east and west for months. Lee knew it was only a matter of time before Grant would capture the city. So in March of 1865, in his second inaugural address, Lincoln asked the Americans to forgive and forget, stating that with malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive together to bind up the nation's wounds. We will have a Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. April 2nd of 1865, Grant's troops broke through the Confederate lines at Petersburg, and by that evening, Richmond had fallen to the Union troops. Lee's army retreated to the town of Appomattox, and on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrenders to Grant. Grant offered Lee generous terms. He stated that the Confederates had only to give up their weapons and leave in peace. They would not be taken into custody. They would not be thrown in jail. Nothing would happen. Lee and his men did that and rode off, and the Union troops started to celebrate. But Grant immediately silenced them and said, "The war is over, but remember that the rebels are our countrymen again." So the war's toll on the North and the South, it was the bloodiest conflict the U.S. had ever fought. There were 260,000 Confederate soldiers that gave their lives in the war, and the Union dead exceeded 360,000, including 37,000 African Americans, and 500,000 men were wounded. Two key results from the war. One, it reunited the nation. It would bring everybody back together. And two, it put an end to slavery. Don't mind the typo there. Slaver is not a word, it's slavery. But almost a century would pass before African Americans would begin to experience the full meaning of freedom, which is very sad to think. That is our conclusion of the Civil War in the quick version. After this, we will start talking about Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, that means like bringing the country together. There's going to be disagreements on how that should be done. Some people from the North are going to state that the South should be punished in some way, and why should we have to pay for the destruction that took place in the South during the fighting? Who's going to pay this debt? What will we do? So stay tuned for that in the next unit. Thanks, guys.